Hugely delighted to welcome, I'm sure you are too, Gavin Francis, a GP and award-winning writer whose work has just rightly drawn global praise. We're talking about this book today, The Bridge Between Worlds. It is an amazing read, an amazing piece of work. It is absolutely astonishing. It's lyrical, it's evocative, it's emotive, but it's also analytical. You get a travelogue of some of Gavin's life and his family's life, but you get a travelogue in the brain as well, an intellectual travelogue, the connections that we have as humans, the connections we have on a physical level, the connections we have on an intellectual and psychological level. It's absolutely astonishing. It examines the issues, I think we'll discuss this in a moment, which unite us as human beings, bearing in mind the bridge metaphor, the idea of uniting. But of course, those bridges can be a way of colonializing people. They can be a way of suppressing people. They can be a way of, in the Ukraine and Russia context, very much a way of imposing power rather than opening dialogue and discussion. And it discusses very much, and this was really striking, bridges within the spirit, bridges within the psyche. I'm sure we'll get to all of that. I'm looking forward to discussing it and getting questions from you. It's a quite superb work. And Gavin, a very, very warm welcome. And Gavin's going to open us up by just a little reading, just to give us a taste of where we are. Gavin, please.
Yes, so thanks, Brian. Thanks for that introduction. And thank you to everybody at the Book Festival here for inviting me back. This has got to be the highlight of my Book Festival year. Cove and Kilcreggan.
He says that to the Book Festival.
No, it's just fantastic to come to this wonderful community hall and such great turnout, such great engagement. It's a real highlight for me of the literary scene in Scotland. So well done to all of you organisers too. So this book is about bridges as metaphors too, as well as bridges in real life, as Brian intimated there. And just before I do that reading, I wanted to set the scene. You know, there's a great line from the anthropologist Claude Lévi-Strauss, the famous anthropologist, and he said, animals are as good to think with as they are to eat. And I would argue that bridges are as good to think with as they are to cross. They're very good metaphors for all sorts of things. And I hope we'll get into some of those different meanings, ramifications over the course of the evening, of the afternoon, sorry. So a short reading here. My hope for this book is that may itself be a kind of bridge from writer to reader and from past into future. It's a memoir of my own restlessness, but also an exploration of the way travel can influence and inform perspective. It's a celebration of connection and cross-pollination. It has its origins in, believe it or not, ladybird books that I read enthralled as a child, and in many years travelling and admiring bridges, thinking about what connects people and what divides them. It isn't a history of bridges, but an exploration of their shifting meanings, actual and metaphorical, over 2,000 years of engineering and almost 50 years of travel. Even the word metaphor means carrying a cross, in the sense that the best metaphors build a bridge of meaning between speaker and listener. This book takes for granted the idea that bridges are among the most powerful of humanity's creations in terms of improving lives and circumstances, often emblematic of a culture, but also acknowledges their troubling martial history. Some of the finest bridges in the world were intended to put one community at the mercy of another.
Yeah.
It's arguable that bridge engineers have had a greater impact on the development of global history than military commanders. And though bridges have been used for warfare as much as to foster civilian connections, it's impossible not to salute their builders. They take expertise gleaned by centuries of engineering and turn it into the most civil and civilizing of purposes. They take the stuff of barriers and build from them crossings that speak not to our vulnerability to fear, but our capacity to connect. They're modern cathedrals, in a sense, being the grandest of our constructions, a manifestation of what's best of our civilization, embodiments of beauty and utility. Images of bridges are perennially popular because of the way they inspire imaginative crossings, dreams of escape and connection, loyalty and love. You can tell something about a society from the confidence and the extravagance of its great bridges, as well as from its more humble crossings of wood and rope and vine.
Super.
Thank you.
Gavin, indulge me if you would. I'm going to come to your own background, but indulge me a little. When I was working in the House of Commons in the early 80s, early to mid and indeed late 80s, when Margaret Thatcher was Prime Minister, I got a train into Waterloo and walked over Westminster Bridge every day. And as a former English student, the lines of Wordsworth echoed in my mind as I went across. And you refer to that in the book, the lines composed upon Westminster Bridge. Is that just indulgence in? It's just wonderful to see that there can be your own lyricism there about the bridges, but it's not entirely unknown in literary history as well.
No, it's a big yes. There's a line I quote there from Wordsworth actually. He's just writing about views over London, in which ships, towers, domes, theatres, and temples lie open unto the fields and to the sky, all bright and glittering in the smokeless air.
Yeah.
And the format of this book is that it starts from, I was born in 1975. So it begins with...
You can go off folk, you know. That was a wee bit earlier than that. Just a touch.
It begins with my first memory of the importance of bridges, which is the Ladybird book, Billy Goat's Gruff.
Lovely.
1977.
Oh, you've got them in the palm of your hand now, Gavin.
1977, trip, trap, And recently, when I was thinking about this book, I thought, what was the exact Ladybird book I had? So I went on eBay and had a look through all the different... There's been hundreds of volumes of Billy Goat's Gruff, produced by Ladybird over the years. And this one popped up, which just immediately zoomed into my recesses of my hippocampus, this shock of seeing this troll, this blue troll.
Oh.
I remembered the intensity, the visceral emotion of that book. And so it begins in the 70s with that and the Ladybird Book of Bridges, which we may also touch on, and then goes through the 80s, 90s, noughties, 2010s, 2020s, getting an ever-widening circle of places I went to, and then as I had kids of my own, narrowing back down again. So it kind of takes a big reach around the world, slowly over 20, 30 years, and then draws back in. And that London reference was when the first time I went to London, I was 17, and I got sponsored by the Fife Industry Council to go to a science forum in London, and it blew my mind. It really opened the world up to me. And so the reference there to London Bridge and the Thames is all about that period of my life.
Earth indeed has not anything to show more fair, and I agree with Wordsworth on that. But you lived near the Forth Bridge as a child, so that must have been influential in your imagination at the very least.
Yeah, absolutely. So, do you know, the idea of the Billy Goat's Gruff is that bridges have got these great capacity to connect, but also to divide.
Aye.
And when you live in Fife, that's very viscerally evident when the weather's bad and you can't get over the bridge. So yeah, to me it was always a really special thing to go over the rail bridge. From North Queensferry, very, very special. And now I live in South Queensferry, so I have this view of the kingdom of Fife without actually living there.
Is that the best way to view Fife? I mean, listen, I'm a Dundonian. I'm allowed to be cheeky about Fife. They're very, very cheeky, very, very, very cheeky about Dundee. So I'm allowed to be cheeky back. I mean, I remember when the Tayrod Bridge was built and replaced these ferries, and you could stop the ferries. You could keep them out. But when it's the bridge, oh dear.
The bridge, you're stuck with it.
Yeah.
Yes, no, there's something in that. Most of my, I went to medical school in Edinburgh. Most of my professional career has been in Edinburgh, and to not have to face the traffic jams in the morning to get over the bridge is a big reason I live in South Queensferry rather than North Queensferry.
But I mean, mildly seriously for a second, there's that spark from the Forth Bridge, that spark from that memory of there's a hideous troll lurking beneath bridges, as well as an opportunity to go to the other side. Is that perhaps inspirational in your writing here?
Yeah, I think so, because when you live on the banks of the Firth of Forth, as I have all my life, they dominate your mind, they dominate your mentality, but they're beautiful too. You don't live in their shadow, you live in their light in a way. And now that we've got this new Queensferry crossing,
which only yesterday was closed apparently for the first time, and the old Forth Bridge are going, hi, I knew you'd need me. It's back in again, Forth Road Bridge.
Yeah, there's a certain conjunction of ice and wind direction, which means that ice builds up on the new cables and falls.
Crossing, yeah.
But which happens very, very, very rarely. And of course, everybody's completely like, this was a complete waste of 1.4 billion quid.
No, it's a lovely bridge. It's a wonderful one. But I just thought the old one was having a little laugh, as if to say, you see, you think you're that smart.
I've got a confession.
You know?
Last night I was driving home from Edinburgh to South Queensferry, and I saw that they'd closed the Queensferry crossing and they'd opened the road bridge, and I went over. Just for old time's sake.
Oh, that's terrific. That's great. That's great. You mentioned division. One of the things you talk about in your book, you talk about at various points throughout, is the context of union and division, and you talk about Britain leaving the European Union and the possibility of there being a separation, if you like. I mustn't use that phrase because it's deeply pejorative, but the abolition of the Act of Union 1707 was one that was coming to mind. Obviously, when you wrote about that, you talk about the UK's retreat from empire in that context as well. It's a very interesting series of interlinked thoughts.
So the first bridge really that's mentioned here is the first time I went over the Tweed. So the first time I went to England when I was just a wee boy, and that sort of my parents told me there was this line on the ground, or line through the middle of the river. And I don't know how many of you have been over the Union Chain Bridge just upstream of Berwick. It's lovely. It's wide enough for one car, and halfway over the bridge there's a line. On the bridge it says Scotland, England, and if you can jump back and forth. And it seems to me like a quite extraordinary metaphor, to be told that this is a line that is really powerful and changes law, the different legal provision on either side, but you can't see anything there. So I felt very strongly I wanted to write about bridges and division in terms of the debate we've been having as a country for the last over the last decade or so, in particular about Scottish independence, but also at the same time this retreat from the European Union and how the UK is more tentative and afraid, if you like, of connection. So,
do you think that's in the collective soul? Do you think that's in the psyche?
Absolutely.
In the body politics, body politics, certainly.
Yes, it's part of the same sort of thrust. There's a lot more distrust. There's a lot more anxiety around, and it's almost like as the connectivity of the world has exploded through the internet, there is an increasing anxiety about the potential consequences of that connectivity.
Interesting.
And so we retreat more towards what is safe.
And what is familiar and what is... We retreat literally behind the bridge and put up the bollards.
Even when I was a student, I remember getting a ferry from... I've taken a ferry from Newcastle to Bergen, for example, or from Lerwick to Tórshavn in Faroe. And all those ferries are gone. Britain has literally cut itself off from so many of connections that we used to sustain. And
you regret that, obviously.
There is not a single passenger ferry now that can take you even to Denmark. You can't go from Harwich, from Hull, you can't go from anywhere. The only ferries left are across the Channel, or you can go to Amsterdam or Zeebrugge. But there's nothing left to Denmark, nothing to Norway. And so we're really... I feel we're impoverishing ourselves a little bit.
You talk later in the book as well. I'll just come to this now because you mentioned the word anxiety. Something I write a column in the Herald, and come on, allowed one plug. I'm allowed one, for goodness sake. I write a column in the Herald. Okay, that's two. And I'm writing constantly about what I feel is the current mood, and the zeitgeist is not. It's not fear. It's not fear and trembling as Kierkegaard would have it. It's anxiety. There's a post-pandemic anxiety. There's a post-cost of living crisis anxiety. There's a mid-Ukraine and mid-Gaza anxiety, but it's anxiety, it's uncertainty, it's disquiet. And you talk about the rise of this in a European context rather than in the Scottish and UK context that I was writing about.
Yeah, very much. And this book touches on a lot on the positives of connection, but also tries to explore and dig down into the negatives and the fears of connection. So, for example, you brought up Ukraine, Brian, the precursor to the Russian invasion of Ukraine was the completion of this magnificent bridge to Crimea. So Putin produced, Putin's engineers made this absolutely fabulous. After occupying Crimea, he built this amazing bridge to Crimea, which then, of course, became an artery for military equipment to support the invasion of Ukraine from the south. And there's a long history of this in British colonialism too. Yeah. And I talk in particular about the original example of that is the bridge that the Persians built across the Bosporus to Gallipoli Herodotus, the founder of history, tells us this story of the Persian invasion of Greece, that he came along all the way from Iran and he built this pontoon bridge across the Bosporus, the Hellespont, which was purely to aid a military invasion and occupation of Greece. And so bridges can bring as many problems as they solve.
Can bring fear, can bring anxiety, can bring concern and disquiet.
And a great friend of... Is my mic working okay? Yeah.
Yeah, it is, yeah.
A great friend of this festival, you all know, is Alan Little. And Alan and I made a trip around Bosnia a few years back, whereby, which I describe in this book, which typifies the potential drawbacks or the potential fear that surrounds too much connectivity. Do you know, all these beautiful old Ottoman bridges that you find in Bosnia, the one in Mostar, which was blown up by the Croatian army, the one in Sarajevo, which was the scene of the assassination of Franz Ferdinand, the one in the east in Visegrad, the bridge over the Drina, which is in the Serbian part of Bosnia. All these bridges have been used as symbols of the Turkish Empire and therefore hated by the local Christian populations. And so although we tend to see them as symbolic of interconnectivity, of cooperation and collaboration, they're not always seen that way by the local population.
Tell us a bit about yourself, Gavin. Obviously, a medical background, but you describe in the book, and I love that section, you describe a burning sense to travel more widely, and you say that was often inspired by crossings and bridges and connections.
Yeah, so when I was a wee boy, I didn't really want to be a doctor. I wanted to be a geographer, very much. I wanted to make maps. And I luckily or unluckily, somebody gave me an atlas of anatomy when I was about 15. I thought, oh no, that's what I'll learn about. I'll do that instead. I'll learn about the landscape within.
Okay.
But as soon as I qualified in medicine, that old desire to travel and make sense of the world started up again. So yeah, the book is in a way a kind of... I said in the intro, it's a memoir of restlessness in a way, these sort of circles getting wider and wider, first across Europe and then into Africa, into Asia, eventually into America, and then a gradual retreat back. And trying...
Did you travel initially alone, then with your wife, and then with your offspring, or is that the way it built and developed? Or?
Yes, exactly. So, I first started on my own going... just even things like interrailing. I describe a trip to southern Africa, trips into Asia. And then with my wife, I did a big motorbike journey, went from Orkney to New Zealand by motorcycle. And it's quite a few of the bridges we describe in this book.
That must have taken a day or two, eh?
Yeah, that took...
Even just getting off Orkney, that would take long enough,
Yeah, that took a year and a half.
That took a year and a half, yeah.
And then when we had kids, as you all know, the orbit goes in like this. And so the later bridges that are described in this book are more, for example, I went to the Peace Bridge over the Foyle in Northern Ireland with the kids. I made the road trip around all the Scandinavian bridges that connect the islands of Denmark and Sweden to Norway and so on.
Yeah.
I made with my son, on a road trip with my son. And so travelling with kids is completely different, of course. It's a different way of seeing the world, but it has its own...
Because they see different things from what you're seeing, yeah?
Yeah, absolutely. And also they change the whole logistics. Travelling with any child below the age of 12, is always have a separate bag full of snacks. Because... you're going to see tantrums throughout the day if you don't keep their tummies full.
I used to adopt much the same tactics with camera crews, but I mean but I remember as a young dad, somebody who did not have kids saying to me, "What do you do when you want to do something and your kids want to do something else?" I said, "You've lost me. I'm sorry." So well, they want to do one thing, and I said, "Oh no, I understand. You lose." It's really simple. It's just, as long as you adopt that tactic from the very beginning, it's quite easy. So you found yourself, your life an expansion, then your life a contraction, or is it expanding into contracting like the heart valve or something like that?
It's a contraction in terms of geographical scope, but it's a completely different way of travelling.
But you're still practising medicine, aren't you? You're still, yeah.
Yes. Yeah, I've got a very interesting job just now where I work 1 week in 4 for Highland. I work in northern Sutherland and do a sort of single-handed practice 1 in 4, and then I work for the medical school in Edinburgh 3 weeks out of 4. So it's a bit of a kind of peripatetic medical career.
And you enjoying that? Is it very different practicing medicine in the far north of Scotland? I mean, it's the same illnesses, I presume, but is it difficult different in terms of? No,
it's wonderful. I really, really enjoy it. I really love it. The great thing about medicine is wherever you go in the world, people are largely, by and large, the same. They have the same kinds of illnesses. But the geography...
people are largely supportive and understanding as well, you know, yeah.
Yeah, I think so. And I really enjoy working up there because the folk are great, and also the landscape's very, very beautiful. And I like that immersion of being a single-handed doctor where I'm on call day and night, 24/7, but just for a week because I couldn't sustain it. I think it's very hard to sustain.
That would get stressful, yeah.
Well, it's difficult with a family too.
Yeah. I mean, you can say, "Let me through. I'm a doctor." I could try. Trust me, I'm a journalist. It's never worked. It's never worked. You know, there was a brief period when, around about the time of the financial crash, when bankers were hated more than journalists, and it was a golden age. You know, it was an absolutely golden age. Let's talk
about politicians.
Politicians are down there as well, deep down and troublesome. Let's talk about some of the issues you raise in the book. I'm going to come out for questions in a few minutes, but let's talk about some. You mentioned Africa earlier, and where the bridges were pretty much obviously built by colonial purposes, built for colonial purposes, and I think in a different context. Gandhi said he believed the British built bridges, as you note, to subdue the Indian people and extract wealth. Is this something that, you know, this is the imposition of a structure upon an indigenous people? Is that how we should see these things?
Yes, that discussion is on there's a chapter here on the Victoria Falls Bridge over the Zambezi.
Yeah.
And when I went to that region of Africa in my early 20s, I was really trying to understand much more about colonialism and trying to understand. My forebears were all sort of working class folk from Ayrshire, from Ross and Saltcoats.
Oh, right.
So they weren't involved in directly profiting, if you like, from colonialism, except in the sense that indirectly, of course, the industry, the shipbuilding, all of this stuff, indirectly, of course, the economy was profiting from that. But I wanted to go and find out more about it. And everywhere I went, everybody I spoke to, I would try and understand this. And I felt a lot of hostility in the part of Africa where I was, because people would only see the colour of my skin, and they would think that I was bringing certain assumptions that I was trying very hard not to bring. And the Victoria Falls Bridge is a really good example of a very, it was designed by Cecil Rhodes. It was to be the final rivet in this Cape to Cairo railway, which was going to make the whole of Africa.
Could scarcely be a more colonial project at outside site, yeah.
And it was to funnel natural resources down to the ports in Mozambique and so on. And then the bridges that we described that Gandhi refers to, beautiful bridges that the British built in India over in Calcutta and also over the Indus. He complained that they were doing the same thing, that it was a fig leaf, the idea that they were just to benefit the local population. And so that is yet another angle that I try to come in to examine why, of course, bridges and interconnection and traffic and communication and collaboration are all good things, but we also have to be aware of their limits. Otherwise, we can get ourselves into great difficulty.
But I mean, if you come from the West Coast, Ardrossan or Saltcoats could have been the kicking off point for Boris Johnson's bridge to Northern Ireland. And that never happened. Funny it never happened. Yeah.
Well, what I thought was very interesting about that Boris Johnson announcement was he made it just at the same time as the final details of the Brexit deal were signed and made into law. Mm-hmm. And so it was almost like Johnson recognised that this sealing of ourselves off, this closing, this pulling up of a drawbridge would create anxiety in people, and he had to make a symbolic announcement of fostering a new connection at the same time, as if in compensation almost. But, it would be easier to build a bridge to Calais than to build a bridge from Campbelltown to Northern Ireland. The water is so deep there. Yeah, it's technical challenge is very difficult. Now I forget what was the value of it. It was something like £25 billion it was put at or something. And Nicola Sturgeon said, if he's got 25 billion going spare,
we'll have it. Yeah.
I'm sure there's other things we could spend it on. She said.
No, that was when you mentioned Africa. You mentioned Gandhi. In the Gandhi section, you talk about division again, partition being, you know, a physical division, but also a division between peoples, a division between territories, but also between peoples. Is that something that concerns you? This sense of anxiety, this sense of division, this sense of breaking away again?
Yeah, and part of the search of this book is to find the edges of that. So I understand people's anxieties about limitless openness, if you like. You know, it would be very hard sell in a democracy to say you should have completely open borders. Where is the limit to that? And I think that was a lot of what drove the anxiety towards voting for Brexit. This idea of where does it end? Where does the openness of the EU end? At what point do we create a kind of polity that says this is our welfare state for these people that live here and this is the edge of it?
Yeah.
And so part of this book is an exploration or a testing of what the edges of that might look like.
Yeah.
And I really do think it's driven by social media and interconnectedness. You know, we've got such instant access to finding out about anything in the world everywhere.
Yes.
That it tends to polarize a little bit, and it tends to drive this sense that something bad is going to happen imminently, because there's definitely something bad going on somewhere at every moment. So,
do you think that's enhancing the anxiety that there is in our collective?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. I think social media has been a wonderful boon for lots of people for lots of reasons, but it's like most things in life, it's a mixed blessing. You know, it comes with a huge amount of other baggage and other problems that worry me. As a GP, they worry me hugely.
Do you think Brexit was, you know, partly pulling up the drawbridge, closing borders in that regard?
Yeah, no, I think that was what it was quite explicitly.
Yeah.
Do you know, if we think about the sort of Farage posters and so on just before Brexit, it was very clearly aimed at heightening the anxiety that there was a limitless number of people coming to take advantage of the British welfare state, and that if we didn't pull up those drawbridges, then it was doomed.
I think it arises from a sense of puzzled disquiet about identity in England, not in Scotland. It arises from perhaps three factors. One, the good and sensible people of England wondering what it means to be English when we have the discussion about the Union, the 1707 Union. If they thought about it at all previously, they thought about it as all English, British interchangeably, and then so they thought about that. Secondly, it was disquiet about the loss. It's the loss of. It's not just the loss of empire. It's the loss of status that they thought was involved in subjugating themselves to the European Union. And thirdly, and perhaps the biggest of all, was immigration. They were what is left of England.
Yeah, but
they were feeling if people come from elsewhere. I'm not defending any of these motivations. I'm simply saying it's like struck me as being like the Pujadist movement in the France of 1950s and 60s.
You know, when the UK joined the EU, or the Common Market, the front page of the Daily Mail was, "Now we can lead Europe."
Oh, God almighty.
Do you know, there was a time
when we can tell them what's been going wrong and put it right.
There was a time...
Teach the French to cook,
When there was a feeling that would be an avenue for Britain to find a role post-Empire.
Yes, it was.
Was leading in Europe. But something happened, something changed, and they clearly felt that was not going to happen.
Well, we joined in 73, we had a referendum in 75 driven by the left of the Labour Party, and then eventually we had a referendum driven by the right of the wider conservative movement. When again it was a sense of withdrawing, you know, drawing back, and I'm convinced it was a sense of trying to re-establish a sense of identity. And in terms of that discussion over Brexit, the EU didn't help David Cameron in the slightest. They gave him, he went to get a renegotiation, and he was given not even peanuts. It was peanut husks and shells. He got nothing. And he got nothing, and he did nothing with it. But anyway, that's getting into a more of an obsession of mine rather than the context of your book. Let's go out for questions.
Rather than the belly goat's gruff.
We'll get back to the belly goat's gruff. Let's go out for questions from the audience if there are. And I know it's a tricky topic, but anything you wish, have a go. You get a Mars bar for the best. There's a head being scratched.
Nice,
so that's coming
upstairs.
towards a question. Yes, please. There's a hand there. Thanks very much indeed.
What about tunnels?
Oh, that's a Mars bar instantly. That's terrific. Well done.
Well, it sounds, maybe you're a civil engineer. You know, the Scandinavians are trialling waterproof tunnels that they put under the sea, under the fjords, and they moor them to kind of big floats. And so they're bridges that go under the water, and they use the floats that anchor the tunnels to generate wave power. So maybe we'll not bother with bridges in the future. We'll have tunnels that go under the sea that also generate our electricity.
A tunnel under the Tay, and it can energise Newport. You know that will...
There is actually a tunnel under the Forth, but it's between two collieries, and it's only wide enough for a trolley of coal.
You didn't know that, now, did you? Aye, sitting there, smart. He knows his stuff on bridges and tunnels. Any other questions from the audience? A Mars bar competitor for our tunnels, friend. No? Okay, I'll come back to you in a moment. Let's talk about some of the other issues raised in the book, Gavin. You talk when you talk about Venice, a city of bridges. But you say it is also about bridges between East and West. It's a city that, and you describe it as having grown wealthy on the slave trade. So again, there's this evident opulent beauty, but at the same time, the wealth that created that beauty has arisen from culpable sources.
Well, I didn't know that about Venice. I found out in my research that it was before the Slavic people of Eastern Europe were converted to Christianity, they were fair game to be slaves by to be enslaved by Muslim slavers or by Christian slavers. And so hence the word Slav is one of the roots of it. And Venice was the slave market of Europe. So people would be captured in Eastern Europe, brought to Venice, and then sold either to the Byzantine Empire or the Islamic empires, the Caliphate, to work as slaves. And I didn't realise that was how it got its start in life, Venice, as a kind of offshore slave market. And I described the bridge to Venice. It's called the Ponte della Libertà, the Bridge of Freedom.
Somebody was having a joke there, weren't they?
The Bridge of Freedom is a bridge in a slave state. Slave market, but it's now, of course, causing a huge amount of problems. The over-tourism of Venice is threatening the fabric of the city itself.
Yeah, you say that it is choking on tourists who are killing the city they claim to love. Do you have sympathy with these arguments?
Yeah, very much. So I interviewed a chap who's a true Venetian, one of these kinds of people who considers the front door of his house the one that opens onto his boat, and the back door is the one that opens onto his alleyway. And he told me that the Italian state has constructed the Venice municipality in such a way that 3/4 of the population live on the mainland in Mestre. And so they repeatedly try and have referenda to separate or to get a measure of autonomy. But because the voting includes the people who live on the mainland, they're not allowed to. So the Italian state reserves the power to decide who gets in and out of Venice, about mooring these giant ships right next to it and so on. And the people of Venice actually don't get much of a say.
I mean, we have this issue arising in Barcelona. We have it arising in other
in Edinburgh
cities. In Edinburgh, absolutely. The people of Edinburgh are getting furious. The sounds of scones being dropped everywhere.
Rattling pearls.
Rattling the pearls, rattling in the cheap seats. Yeah. What do you make of that argument that we are ruining by going to see these places and experiencing them? We are ruining the very thing we purport to cherish.
Yeah, absolutely. It's part of this theme that I was exploring about the problems you can get when you have too much connectivity or too much connection to a place. Yeah. And it can start to overrun and reduce the value of the thing that you claim to love.
Yeah.
Yes, and all over, whether it's Barcelona or Venice or Prague, Amsterdam, Edinburgh, now with its levy that it's putting into place next year, they're trying to find ways of actually profiting, both dissuading people from coming and the people who want to come anyway, creaming off some of their money in order to put it into local community projects and initiatives.
Not an easy one though, is it? Because Edinburgh's got the largest arts festival in the world, and it kind of needs folk to come. And yet on the other hand, it's something like 60-70% of the tickets are actually sold to Edinburgh postcode, so it's a local event as well. But they do need the visitors coming in, and then there's every year there's endless complaints about the city being swamped during August.
Yeah, no, it's very difficult. But they're starting to explore different ways of, proving your residency and so on, showing your postcode, getting different rates and so on.
Uh-huh. Let's talk about another one, Rome. You talk about Rome as an impossible indigestion of architecture. I love that. Isn't that a wonderful phrase? Absolutely wonderful phrase. But in that context, you recall that the pontificate, the pontifex, was claiming that the papal right to be a bridge between God and man. I mean, that's a pretty gigantic issue to bring into the discussion, but let's have a bash at that as well. Yeah.
Yeah, sort of idea of the Pope being Pontifex Maximus. It's sort of, I looked into that title because it was such an odd title. It always seemed to me strange that the Pope was called the Pontiff, which means essentially bridge master. And then I thought, well, bridge master between what? And apparently, mostly it means this idea of a bridge between God and man, but it also means this idea that at one point, the rivers were believed, it's a sort of Roman pagan idea, that rivers were inhabited by gods. And to build a bridge over a river was something you could only have the kind of confidence or arrogance to do if you were invested with this special, almost magical power to be a bridge master.
But it's clever how Christianity has regularly adopted the pagan, like Easter and Easter and all that sort of thing.
Absolutely. And when all the different saints, I think it's really interesting that St. Bridget, for example, is often seen in the wells and the streams, and the Celtic, the pagan goddess of wells and streams also began, I can't remember her surname, you'll know it, began with BR as well. It wasn't Bridget, but it was something like there was a lot of that adoption. The chapter on Rome is very interested in this idea that Hadrian, who we all know as having built a bloody great wall.
Bloody great wall, yes.
Hadrian's wall.
With a rather shorter tree next to it these days, yeah.
Yes, Hadrian built one of the most beautiful bridges in Rome, which was to connect the Pantheon with his mausoleum, which is now where the Vatican is. So if you want to cross between sort of secular city centre Rome and the Vatican, you have to cross this. Ponte Sant'Angelo it's called. It was called later. It was called the Bridge of the Saint of Angels, Ponte Sant'Angelo. And the old Roman idea was that you should always situate graveyards over the river on the other side from the main centre of the city. And Hadrian wanted his mausoleum on this far side of the city. And so baked into the idea of this bridge was that it was all about pilgrimage. It was about, he was expecting people to make pilgrimages to his mausoleum after he died and became a god. And now that is the bridge that people cross to go to the Vatican to make pilgrimage. And Dante wrote about it. There's a wonderful line in the Inferno when... So Dante is writing in the 1300s. It's over 1,000 years after this bridge was built. Still standing, still as good as it was when it was new. He described how there was so many people pushing and pulling over this bridge, Hadrian's bridge, that they came up with the radically modern innovation of making people go on the right as they went that way and on the right as they go that way. So Dante was trying to summon an idea of how crowded it was in hell. And he said, it was just like on the Ponte Sant'Angelo, when the pilgrims are so crushed that you've got to make them go in that direction on that side and that direction on the other side. And if you go there now in Rome, that's exactly the same now. So many people crushing in the direction of the Vatican, except you're more likely to be sort of baseball cap and cargo shorts rather than in your mendicant.
Where do you find the bridging of religion fits in with you as a scientist and a traveller and an examiner of the human nature? Do you find a space for it at all in either in your life or in collective life?
Yeah, of course, absolutely. Do you know, it's a very big question, Brian, but it's mostly, I suppose, in my work as a GP. Do you know, you can't reduce everything about human life down to purely utilitarian ideas.
Interesting.
You know, the meaning.
Interesting.
It always strikes me, the meaning of life is meaning, really. Everybody finds a different meaning in life, don't they? And the meaning of your life is the meaning that you find in your life.
Yes.
And a big part of my work as a GP, particularly dealing with people with mental health issues, is finding out what the meaning of life is for them.
Finding out what they're seeing, what they're observing, what their perspective is, perhaps.
Yeah, you can have a nice house, easy income, be not subject to war or famine, and still be pretty miserable.
Yes.
If you don't have any meaning, or you don't see any meaning in it. So, of course, that dimension to human life, human spirituality is very important to me, and I think to everybody.
You say in the book, let me find it. You insist that medical science is not just about science, but about common humanity. Is that what you're explaining there? That it's, it's not about just diagnosis and the inner map as you described it earlier when you were talking about moving from geography to medicine, but about much more than that, and about our common connections and common bridges, if you like to put it that way.
Yeah, there's a chapter in this book about Peru, and it's about the rope bridges of the Incas. And I don't know how many of you have read The Bridge of San Luis Rey by Thornton Wilder. It won the Pulitzer Prize a few decades ago. A wonderful book, and it uses the precarious rope bridges of the Incas as the most beautiful metaphor for the precariousness of life. And there's a rope bridge that collapses and everybody falls to their death. And it's set in the 1700s. And the priest dedicates, the book is the priest's search to find meaning in what happened to these innocent people. And he concludes, and the conclusion of that book, and why I think it won the Pulitzer Prize, was that he comes down to the fact that the connections between people and the connections we build between people that we love and between people in our wider community are what makes life worth living. And that, for me, is one of the messages that came through most strongly as I got towards the end of writing this book, after exploring all these ways in which connections are helpful and are harmful, and that ultimately I finish it with having a pedal over the Forth Road Bridge to visit my brother. Because it's the connections we make in life, I think, that make life worth living.
Any trolls on the way? No. You have just in 5. No. Stop it, Brian. Stop these 5 gags. That's absolutely shocking. Tell me about. Let's talk about that a little more. How does one adapt medical science to cope with the sort of issues you are talking that are actually perhaps the genuine thing that driving the fear, anxiety, and therefore illness in the patient you're attempting to work with?
It's like Jen sorting out the Ukraine-Russian conflict.
That's
You're asking me all the easy ones.
That's right. Ask all the easy ones.
Well, modern medicine, this is going a bit off topic, modern medicine is so unbelievably powerful. But it's powerful in a very certain way. It's powerful at raising more questions than it answers quite often. Okay. So, for example, if you go and put yourself through an MRI scanner, I don't recommend it. Sometimes you'll see adverts now in the paper, go and get a full body scan for a 50th birthday present or something. It will come back with a whole load of things. That's a bit, maybe that you should worry about that. Modern medicine generates all these different anxieties. And one of the tasks of being a physician in the modern world is to try and reassure people that the technology actually now takes us too far, and that we have to bring it back to say what's important to you, what really matters to you. Gregor Smith, this CMO in Scotland, has been trying to push this idea. We really need to wake up to a bit more realistic practice in our medicine. We need to think really hard about what's the benefit of these very expensive interventions. What are the risks of them? What would happen if we just didn't do them? And more, I think, the idea that medicine could be taken over by algorithms or robots is kind of ridiculous, because most of medicine is about these very difficult conversations that need humanity, and they also need a lot of clinical experience.
So you need to understand not just the diagnosis, not just the x-rays and the MRI scan and all that stuff. You need to understand what the human being is thinking and feeling, the one who is sitting before you and asking for your advice and help.
Yeah, a computer can do that. So a computer could spit out and could run your DNA tests and tells you have a 27% chance of getting Alzheimer's disease.
Yeah. Take the following drugs and,
so what?
And come
what
back
does
next
that
week.
mean? 27% chance. That doesn't mean anything. It means you might, it means you might not. Mm-hmm. You need to see that in context to start to understand, okay, so even if I did develop Alzheimer's disease, even if that does have, my genetics have a bearing on it, what does that actually mean for my life? The computer can't do that.
And is that where a scientific approach, a strictly scientific approach, would go down that road of algorithms and calculations and odds and opportunities?
Exactly. I get these, sometimes people sign up, some of my patients sign up for these apps. They're like algorithms. So I'm not supposed to be talking about the NHS here. But, so the NHS...
We won't tell, will we? We won't tell.
The NHS budget for primary care is £15 per person per month. So that's how much you all pay for the NHS, for having a GP, and a district nurse and all the primary care, opticians, dentists, all that. £15 a person per month. People sign up for these apps and they pay about £15 a month just to have some pixels on their phone. And what happens, in my experience, if you go into these apps and say, oh, I've got a headache or I'm worried about my rash, is it usually comes up and says, go and see your GP. So imagine all these people paying for these apps, just paid that into the primary healthcare service, how much a better service you'd get.
Gavin, you're closely involved in your work in the next generation of medical students. Maybe you could explain that. And then, are they seeing things in this holistic fashion, or are they seeing things in algorithmic fashion as well?
No, we try to train them. So I teach at the medical school, as I mentioned, and I'm involved in selecting the new medical students and so on. And one thing that's really interesting about medical schools of the last 20 years is there was a big push to try and teach empathy. So try and teach people to be more empathetic clinicians.
Love it. I love it.
And then somebody actually did a study and they said, well, look, does this work? And what they found was that they start off day one, week one with the maximum empathy. And what we do is beat it out of them. And it just goes down. So actually the task of medical school is not to teach empathy, is to preserve it. So I see the young people I see are fantastic. They're really great. And they're much better at all this sort of app-based digital world than I am. But that's what we go to doctors because when we're ill, we need somebody we can trust, somebody who's got experience, somebody who can explain things to us, somebody who can work out what's important for us, what our priorities are. And that's what we have to try and teach them.
Yeah. I'm going to raise a hugely sensitive subject that does arises in the book, and arises from your medical work. You tell at one point of treating a patient in an Edinburgh hospital who had survived a suicide jump from a bridge. And you describe it as being hugely traumatic.
Yeah.
And the difficulties of seeing this issue arise for you. That's right, isn't it? That comes through in the book.
Yes, absolutely. And when I was an A&E doctor, I would regularly get called out to an ambulance to certify people dead who had jumped and not survived. So, it's a big issue still in our society. There's actually a lot less suicide now in our society than there was 40 years ago. It's about half that it was in the 80s. But we talk about mental health a lot more now, so maybe it's more in the media than it was back in the 80s.
And does that mean it's in the media in a helpful way, perhaps allowing people to think that they're not alone, or that they're not isolated, they're not at the other side of the bridge, to use your metaphor? Maybe not.
Perhaps. I think it's very, very difficult. It's very difficult. They have to...
What's the reason for the reduction in numbers then? Is there any? Nobody's very sure.
Nobody's very sure. But it's something I touch on in the book, and the way I describe it in the book is I try, because it's such a difficult topic for any, and I apologise if this is upsetting for anybody here, but is that I try to approach it in a kind of slanting way by talking about what's every so often voted the greatest film of all time, which is Vertigo, Hitchcock's Vertigo, and the Golden Gate Bridge, because that's a film that's full of suicides. So but it turns out that they're not real; they're fake suicides. Yeah. And so I described that Golden Gate Bridge and it all the way, which is this beautiful motif in Hitchcock's movie, as it is like a bridge between worlds in a way, between the world of the living and the world of the dead. But then Hitchcock very cleverly turns the whole thing upside down and makes you realise that you've been duped. There's a wonderful tradition, Chinese tradition, of viewing the bridge between the world of the living and the world of the dead as something that we all cross over, that's to do with reincarnation. As well, there's a bridge that you can cross But it is inevitable that you fall in. You can't but fall in. And then you fall into a stream that then depends how you end up being incarnated and so on. And so I try to tease out various threads of cultures around the world that have viewed this division between life and death in the sense of being that kind of crossing.
Are you taught as a doctor, do you teach the next generation of doctors to cope with the sort of trauma you describe in the book? Can you teach that? Can you prepare people for that extent of shock?
I think you can. You have to be able to do the job ultimately, don't you? You have to be able to actually see people in these kind of extreme situations and then be able to carry on. And the way to do that, I think, the way that helped me is to encourage people to talk about their feelings of what they're experiencing, what they're going through.
Okay.
When you do that kind of work. But there's an inevitable amount of hardening that has to happen.
How did you deal with that patient? I won't obviously not use the details, but a patient who survived a suicide jump. Did you try and ferret out the underlying causes?
Yes. So as a junior doctor, you're trained to speak to people who are in that kind of extreme situation by exploring what are called, in the kind of dry language of the clinic, they call them protective factors. So what is protecting somebody or keeping them safe?
What do you mean by that? What's good in their life? Okay.
Well, often it's pets, often it's loved ones.
Oh, my goodness.
Often there's lots of reasons people come up with for wanting to be able to find ways of keeping going. And then try and find out about the situation. Is this a chronic long-term desire or is this an impulsive thing? What can be put in place to try and help keep people?
What is it usually? Is it usually impulsive or usually deep-seated?
Everybody's different.
Everybody's different, yeah.
And then as a doctor, often it's very frustrating because a lot of these problems and difficulties in society, of course, have got social causes. They've got you think, I could fix this problem, but the problem is I have to go back 30 years, give somebody a less abusive childhood, be able to provide them with a house, sort out their benefits. Then I will be able to have a good chance of helping them.
People generally
those things are kind of beyond your remit.
They need help in dealing with societal structures rather than the glib help that perhaps is sometimes offered.
It's more than that, I think, Brett. It's just mental health now. I mean, we went through a brief phase in the 90s where everybody said it was all about serotonin and chemicals in your brain, and it wasn't right at the time, and it's definitely obvious it's wrong now. Do you know, it's always a wee bit biological, but it's a huge amount psychological and sociological.
So it isn't just chemical, it is the psychology as well.
Absolutely not. The jury is in. It is not just your chemicals.
I'm going to tell you a story from my rough trade of journalism. When I was a young reporter on the Press and Journal, you were sent on jobs that were called a pick-up pick, which was getting a picture of somebody that had been, a distinguished person or whatever who had died. And I was sent down to do a pick-up pick with a woman who was just been widowed. Her husband had died on a building site in Inverness. So I got there, knocked on the door and said, I was terribly sorry to hear about your circumstances. And she said, what circumstances? The Highland police thought that Grampian police were informing her in Aberdeen. Grampian police thought that Highland police were informing her in Aberdeen. It turned out that I, as a 22-year-old journalist, was informing her. So I was there for several hours. I sat and discussed with her all the situations. I still left with a picture because that was a part of the task. But I felt that I should sit and discuss it with her. And now that's nothing compared to what you're dealing with and dealing with suicide patients. But that's the example of where a trauma can come and scalp you in the face. And I'm just is medical science ready for the degree of anxiety and tension that you confront? I mean, you'll perhaps encounter people. They don't present with any obvious symptoms, but they present with a series of problems. Is that right? Or do you must go through the chemical and biological diagnosis first, presumably?
No, I don't think. I mean, certainly not in my role in a community as a GP. I'm not getting involved in chemical, biological stuff. I'm just talking to people about their lives. What
is actually causing them?
Yeah, everybody's got circumstances that have driven them to be in a certain way and to have certain struggles and challenges. And
Do you think medicine is losing that or has lost it a bit by being over-dependent on diagnosis and drugs?
I think it probably did for a while when I was at trainee.
Okay.
But it's coming back.
Interesting, Gavin. Interesting. Well, it's turning round again to look at the whole
Yeah,
person.
even now, when I was a trainee in the hospital wards in the Royal Edinburgh Hospital, it was very, it was a kind of a zenith of that purely biological chemical approach. And now the consultant psychiatrists that I meet are much more in touch and in tune with the idea
that's really
that
encouraging.
society
Yeah.
is... changes in society are really what is needed, and changes in environment and setting and housing and benefits and support workers are far more benefit than just a change in the drug.
Right, I've talked a lot about this. I made the error of getting interested in the subject, which is always a blunder. You should try and fight against that. Let's get back for the last. Oh God, it's only a few minutes. Let's get back to the last few to some of the issues that are arising in the book. I love Turkey. It's a wonderful place. It's a country that really is torn by division and torn almost physically by bridges, because a large number of the population, certainly the ones I encountered, both in Istanbul and in the south and in places like Izmir, are looking to build bridges to the west, and others are looking very much to build bridges to the east. You found that division yourself in between Europe and Asia in Istanbul.
Yes, no, and the bridges, I don't know how many of you have been to Istanbul. It's one of my favourite cities in the world.
Place.
It's a true global city, and because you can feel those layers and layers of history going right back through all the Ottoman times and through the Byzantine times, right back to the early Roman. And you have this sense of being when you stand on the shores of the Bosphorus, you can feel you're at this real hinge point of history, but also of geography and of politics and cultures. And I wanted to write not so much about Istanbul, but about the Hellespont.
Yes.
Because, one, there was that great Persian invasion that I talked about, where he built a bridge to invade Greece. But before that, it overlooks where the Trojan War was fought. So you can go to the site, maybe some of you have been there, you can go to the site of Troy now and walk around the city walls. And that is the kind of foundational East-West conflict of our whole literature, is the Iliad. And the fact that when Turkey was defeated in World War I and Ottoman Turkey was carved up, they still retained, they insisted on keeping that little bit of Europe, is very, very telling to me that it is got this long history, as both through the Byzantine Empire and so on, of being an integral part of Europe. And now one of the most beautiful bridges, I think, in the world, certainly the longest bridge, Erdogan finished it just a couple of years ago, is the bridge over the Hellespont. So there is now a bridge over where that Persian emperor built his pontoon bridge, built by the Turks. And it's the most extraordinary thing. Obviously, he's hoping that is going to build greater bridges and links with Europe.
I believe that Troy now is a big posh visitor centre, but I went there with my wife about 40, 50 years ago, and it was just one guy with a wee shop, and we asked, where do we stay, and he said, just camp over there. And I said, but that's the amphitheatre. And he said, yeah, that's fine. But we got on really well with him, because I was then and still am a rather good backgammon player, so we call it tavla. So we played a few games at tavla, and we had a few raki, and so the long day wore on. But the reason I was impressed with this place was he was selling all sorts of trinkets and this thing, but he had a mouldering lump of wood outside the shop, and on it was written in 9 languages, "Remains famous wooden horse of Troy." And I said, that's impressive. What do you do when you've sold it all? He says, out in the forest, remains famous wooden. And I thought, anybody can sell trinkets, but to sell a mouldering lump of wood to the tourists, that is impressive. Let's close with your own conclusion. Too few bridges of peace, too many about colonialism and plundering resources from our neighbours. That's the line you try and draw.
So towards the end of this book, I walk back and forth over the peace bridge over the Foyle with my kids.
I love that phrase. Even just the very thing, you can just see all the cynicism that underlies that.
Yeah, but no, it's great. And then I did this big road trip around Scandinavia, as I said, with my son, and felt that how much the Scandinavian countries have kind of staked their future on collaboration, cooperation.
Yes, they have.
On
It's
building
their
closer
stick.
connections with one another.
Yeah.
And I feel it is a wrong turn for our society if we do turn away from that. And to bring back the discussion in Jen's session too about Trump, we don't know what is going to happen in global power politics. Definitely things are going to change. And
I suspect it's likely he doesn't know what's going to happen in global politics as well, which is much more worrying.
And although I was always very much a pro-European, I'm even more so now, because I think that with a very unpredictable, isolationist America, it's very important that we start building bridges again with Europe.
Oh, you've got a pre-concluding ripple there, Gavin. I'll tell you one story from Northern Ireland. Mark McGuinness was on a visit over here, and he was as Deputy First Minister with his fellow chuckle brother Ian Paisley, and he was getting shown around Edinburgh Castle. And I knew Martin from, how can we put it, earlier days. And I said to him, what do you make of this tour? He looked around and he says, it's lovely. A lot better than some of the British garrisons they kept me in. And I thought that was... It's amazing how it goes straight back to that. Friends, Gavin's going to be upstairs signing copies of the book, which I cannot recommend too highly. It's absolutely wonderful. It's a superb read. It's a great narrative. It's a travelogue, but it's a travelogue of the mind as well. But would you join me in thanking Gavin Francis?
Thanks, Brian.
Tremendous, Gavin. Thank you very much indeed. Thoroughly enjoyed it.